Thank you everybody for joining. Like I said, this is our first MetroNEXT meeting on the topic of our future rapid transit network. So we're so glad to have you and we're looking forward to the conversation tonight. Before we get started, just some standard Zoom etiquette stuff. We do have live transcripts enabled. So if you would like those turned on or off, you can toggle them using the menu bar at the bottom of the screen. Mute yourself when you're not talking. We want to keep this pretty conversational. So if you have a question, you can use the little raise hand feature or just unmute and interrupt us. We want this to be back and forth. So we've got a little bit of content to present. We'll have an engagement exercise later in the presentation, but we'll be taking questions throughout as well as at the end of the whole presentation. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Oh, but before I do, I better introduce myself and our staff. So Evan Schweitz, I'm the lead transit planner here at Metro, and happy to be working on this MetroNEXT effort as we look towards the future of our system and how it evolves to meet the changing needs of the future and of the ways that our city is growing. And I'm joined by several other Metro staff members who I'll allow to introduce themselves now.
Hi, I'm Annie Pagaga. I'm the communications specialist at Metro. I'll be the one kind of monitoring the chat. Feel free to throw your comments in there throughout the whole meeting. We'll be recording that for later. We'll either answer it in the chat or we'll have Evan, maybe Lauren or Ivan answer those on camera too. Thanks.
Bienvenidos, yo soy Iván Maldonado, soy el diputado ejecutivo de Metro. Bienvenidos a MetroNEXT. Estoy aquí presente para ayudarlos si necesitan alguna traducción, si quieren añadir algún comentario, añádaselo a Zoom y nosotros tomaremos el tiempo de contestarle. Buenas noches y estoy aquí para ayudarlos.
Great. Thank you all. I'll introduce myself next. So I'm Lauren Sensick. I'm the CEO of Metro. And I just want to build a little bit upon what Evan was saying about MetroNEXT. We're really excited about this project. And I think even more important to us is the engagement and the ideas and the conversations that are happening as a part of these sessions. For what MetroNEXT is it's really Metro's planning for the next 5 to 10 years of how we want to grow, where we want to grow, what we want our service, what we want transit and mobility, even a larger picture, to look like in the Omaha region in the coming years. And so for us here at Metro, hearing from our riders, hearing from residents and people in the community who maybe don't ride but are interested in riding is very important. So we're looking at this from a number of aspects, from what our service looks like, where it grows, what technology and customer information pieces we need to invest in. But we're taking these in kind of bite-sized chunks. And tonight's really focusing on our rapid transit network and where we'd like to see that grow overall. So without further ado, I'll let Evan take away the slides. But I just want to really express my sincere appreciation for all of your time tonight. It means a lot that you're dedicating and donating your time to help make sure that this is an inclusive and meaningful and well thought out plan that's going to help guide transit in the future.
Thanks, Lauren. So as she mentioned, this is a process that we've been undertaking over the past year. There's different phases of work that we've been doing. So understanding the landscape was really about looking at the data and the information that we had as inputs into the process. Framing the transit network is kind of the topic that tonight's meeting addresses. We are also kind of simultaneously looking at topics that are helping to support additional connections. So how you'll see all this information evolve is we have some additional sessions planned for December, and then we'll take all of that feedback and use it to produce a couple of transit scenarios that we can present back to the public early next year. And that will help us kind of finalize and select our preferred scenario that becomes the MetroNEXT plan, which will go to our board in 2022. And the intent really is for that to kind of highlight the top priorities for our agency over the next 5 to 10 years, so that as we continue to develop and grow, we're moving in a direction that the public has endorsed and is excited about. As we kind of mentioned, there's all different topics that we're seeking to address through this plan. More frequent arrivals on existing routes, improvements to bus stops, other amenities, shelters, and route information. Looking at future orbit lines, which is tonight's kind of deep dive topic. And then new service types to connect the region and potential expansion beyond just Omaha city limits. We, like Lauren mentioned, we've had kind of special topic sessions on each of these different areas. And so we've held several of those already. Tonight's meeting is November 30th on the Rapid Transit Network. And like I said, we have some additional meetings and topics planned for December, which I'll talk about more towards the end of this meeting. Oh, and I should mention, if you've missed anything on these rider amenities or routes and schedules, the recordings are posted on our website. So you're welcome to go to ometro.com/MetroNext and watch any of those. We're still accepting feedback on those topics, so you're not too late. Then you can speed through my mumblings if you want and kind of get the gist of the meeting and still be up to speed. So just to kind of follow up on what work has happened already. Back in the spring, we accepted feedback to identify 15 different corridors to evaluate for future rapid transit service. And so these corridors are listed on the map. And if you can read the menu bar, it kind of highlights the different corridors here. And so we really were kind of opening it up to any possibilities that people wanted to consider. So the orange line right in the center is our orbit line on Dodge, which opened a year ago. Pretty exciting that we've got our first year under our belt, and that's been pretty successful. So as people have commented on that line, and just feedback that we've heard over many recent years, is that Dodge Street line is great, it's not enough. So let's do more. And this is the process to identify what that looks like. So after we received these 15 lines, we did a pretty extensive screening process. And so one of the first things that we wanted to do was, together with our board of directors, identify these core elements of what makes orbit really great and what makes it stand out from regular bus service. And we kind of gleaned it down to 10 corridor principles that are listed on the screen now. The 5 on the left side: frequency, branding, span of service, all-door boarding, and corridor length. Those are all pretty standard commitments that we feel comfortable making with any future orbit line. So we know any additional line that we add in the future is going to have these core elements that have been really important for the Dodge line. The 5 elements on the right side of the screen are qualities that may not exist on every corridor, or they may exist in varying degrees. So our screening process really sought to identify how each corridor compares to the others in terms of potential for things like dedicated bus lanes, transit signal priority, station amenities, station spacing, and pedestrian access. And I will just kind of call out the bus lanes. I remember hearing a question earlier on, does that mean you're only going to build where you can get bus lanes on the whole stretch? And the answer is no. There's pretty limited cases in our region where there's just lanes set aside not being used. So no matter where we look on these corridors, we'll have to do some pretty extensive traffic studies and analysis to see where bus lanes make sense. But we did decide to kind of set the threshold at least 10% of the corridor should have dedicated lanes for transit. And so 10% is right around what we have on Dodge Street. And so we want to make sure that these principles cause us, with any future orbit line, to kind of raise that bar in terms of quality and speed. So if we're not able to achieve that 10% minimum, we probably would look at different improvements that would not necessarily be branded or termed as orbit service. So hopefully that makes sense. Transit signal priority, station amenities, some of these others also have like a minimum threshold. I won't get into all of the weeds on that. But like I said, we used all of these different corridor principles to form our screening criteria, which we use to go through the 15 corridors. So just
thank you for that, Evan. So we have a couple of questions in the chat or comments and some comments about sort of 144th orbit as well as the Epley orbit really having some good potential. And the question was really about, would they be 7 days a week? So I think that's a part of those principles that we're talking about, is that we would be looking at that frequency and that span of service that really sets it apart in terms of how often it's operated. I do want to provide a little bit of context. So in those meetings that Evan mentioned earlier around routes and schedules, we really talked about like all of our routes and which routes we would like to see changes in service hours and changes in schedules and all of those pieces that I think really make sense. For this project, you know, it's really a little bit of a blend of looking at not only where we're going to operate frequently, but also where makes the most sense to put a lot of money into construction and really building sort of a orbit-like service. And so that is just a piece of this. So I would just say in terms of our frequent network, we're looking at kind of both sides of the coin. And we're looking at corridors where we can run more often, we can run later hours and all of those pieces. But we're also kind of looking at the side as where we want to really put some construction dollars to change the infrastructure as well. So I love those questions. Keep them coming in the chat. That's really helpful to guide this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, just to clarify, these corridor principles basically spell out that any future orbit line should warrant the 10-minute service on weekdays and 7 days a week service. And let me get back to the next slide here. So again, the criteria on the left side of the screen is what we used for our initial screening process. So we looked at the number of people and jobs served, access to essential services, which is critically important now as we've all experienced with the pandemic, accessibility, walkability, and the built environment. And then we also looked at an FTA designation called areas of persistent poverty. And so that designation looks at multiple census years, so going back several decades, and any area that was below the poverty line 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and today meets this threshold of being an area of persistent poverty where FTA is especially concerned with how to address transportation in these areas. So we used that as a layer in our screening process. And we also looked at where minority populations are concentrated. And we wanted to approach this as well with an equity lens, that if we're going to be spending millions of dollars on infrastructure for our city, we want to make sure we're leveraging that investment in the communities that most need that added investment. So then after we looked through the 15 corridors, we took the top 8 into advanced screening. And this was around the June-July timeframe. And we looked at opportunities for speed and reliability improvements, which again will vary based on the corridor, existing ridership and travel patterns, development potential was a factor, as well as right-of-way and parking constraints. We also looked at cost effectiveness, so kind of the scale of the investment that would make the most sense versus the scale of the rider impact in those areas. We also looked at our Transit Suitability Index, which is a map that we developed in our first phase of understanding the landscape. I believe it'll appear in slides later. So if you're not familiar, make sure to mention it, and I'll nerd out on explaining all that went into that map. And then we also looked at connectivity to the transit network because we realized that one line isn't going to meet the needs of every person, that it doesn't all work together unless there's links and connections. So with that, we kind of put all of that data together. And then we kind of looked at which corridors were rising to the top, and we began to take those early number results to key stakeholders in those communities. And just kind of wanted to start with the conversation of, does this make sense? What else are we not considering when we only look at the numbers? Because it's not just a numbers game, it's also that human component and understanding the context of these places where people live and work, and how a transit investment would impact them. So we presented our technical screening results, gained lots of good insight, and it all kind of coalesced around 24th Street as being selected as our next corridor for further study. So 24 scored very high. You'll also see this dotted line here on 30th Street north of Dodge up to the MCC Ford campus. And so we have included that in our study area because it scored pretty similarly to 24th. It has a little bit more opportunity for bus lanes. And we didn't feel like we had done enough legwork at this time to select one or the other. So we wanted to kind of advance both options into our next study so that we can really get in more depth with the community about those two options. So that's 24th Street from Ames Avenue all the way south to Q Street. And Route 24 operates in this area today. It runs every 20 minutes. Prior to COVID, it ran every 15. It's a very popular route, very high concentration of ridership today. And since we announced this back in July, we've heard tons of community feedback saying, yes, this makes sense. Some people even saying you should have done this years ago. And I guess there's no time like the present to get started and investigate this further. So we also have some other kind of gray dotted lines here that show that the remaining 8 corridors that advanced through the screening process. So that includes Maple Center, 72nd, Ames, First Avenue, and then the North and South Beltline, which if people aren't familiar with the Beltline, that is what used to be an old industrial rail line that's no longer used. A lot of cases, the property has returned to the adjacent property owner. So it's overgrown. At least on the north side, there's some work currently to rebuild a walking path through that area. There is actually an existing walking path, the Field Club Trail on the south leg of the Beltline. So there's been transit studies in the past that have considered the potential of having this be a combination of a transitway and a trail adjacent to each other, which we think would be a pretty cool option. But again, that's a pretty long-term, very engineering heavy process to kind of figure out what that might look like. So those, like I said, scored pretty well. We don't want to say no yet, but we also know that there's much more work to be done to identify whether those projects have a future. So
actually, I'm going to pause there for just a second, Evan.
Yeah.
There's so much great conversation happening in the chat here, and I really love that. So there's a couple of pieces that were really kind of tied around this rapid transit network that I'd love to tackle first. And then we can kind of keep going through the presentation, and there's so much other rich content that we can really talk about. Early on, there was a question about really considering walkability around bus stops a consideration. I think you saw in the presentation, that's huge. One thing that Metro absolutely recognizes is nobody's trying to get from a bus stop to a bus stop, that people have to be able to get from their home and to their final destination. So we are very much looking at how what the existing walkability, bikeability, accessibility infrastructure looks like, but also the potential for it in the future, especially in very constrained right of ways. So that was a big part of our consideration in terms of identifying new corridors. And then there was, we'll get into some of these other conversations, I think, that are in the chat about other potential places to put routes. I love that feedback. And I think at the end of the presentation, we can really dive into that. But I do want to address one comment about really, you know, growth and increase in population density sort of outside the Omaha metro area, and particularly in Cass County and Sarpy County and around Bellevue. I love that comment, and I think that's something that we're really trying to think about as MetroNEXT. But I do want to share just a little caveat, and that Metro is a political subdivision of the state of Nebraska. And so we're actually, and most people don't know this, we're the transit authority of the city of Omaha. So currently, as it stands, we're only able to operate within the city's limits. We do have some limited service into Bellevue, into Papillion, into Council Bluffs, but that's all done by contract service. So those cities decide if they want to spend money on transit and basically hire us to operate that. I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities for transit to grow, for us to use this study and other parallel efforts to think more regionally, to think about how we connect between cities. And I think that's all a part of this process, but just sharing a little bit of that constraint on the upfront. But the plan here is really to not just think about what we have and what we can do with our current resources and our current limitations, but really also thinking about moving into kind of a broader perspective. And then I love the comment in the chat here about bringing the news to about 24th Street to the Black community who lives on this corridor. Absolutely. Evan's going to dig in here in a little bit and talk about what our planning process is. All we've identified at this point is that just like 10 years ago, we decided Dodge was the place we needed to start studying and figuring out what was the best fit for the community. We're about to do that with 24th Street and really need to involve the community and those who live, work, and play along that corridor to make sure that they're going to be able to shape what the future of that corridor looks like. But I do have to take just a minute before I turn this back over to Evan and brag about Metro staff. For this, we submitted a grant application to do a planning study of this 24th Street corridor that is absolutely an incredibly competitive grant. So they only funded about 10% of the applications across the country. And Evan and team wrote a grant application that's really going to give us the funding and the opportunity to do extensive community engagement and further planning along this corridor. And I know he'll talk about that more in a second, but I can't help but brag because it is a huge accomplishment to have gotten that. So I'll stop now. Thanks, Evan.
All right. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, like Lauren mentioned, we have this new RAISE grant funding, which was announced shortly before Thanksgiving. So we're all pretty excited to kind of start the process of, now that we've celebrated getting the money, we have to work through the logistics of setting up the study process, trying to hire a firm that can help us with the engineering, planning, and community engagement components of this study. So wanted to make sure that everyone's kind of familiar with what to expect and kind of what the options are that we'll be looking at. So the slide that I have up now shows two main options here. On the left, we have Orbit, which hopefully everyone in the audience has had a chance to ride or at least has seen driving up and down Dodge Street. And what that represents is a pretty substantial capital and operational investment. So it takes time to do the engineering work, acquire property if necessary, to build these raised platform stations, which are pretty large. They have lots of tech amenities like real-time arrival. They've got ticket kiosks so that everyone pays before the bus pulls up, and then all three doors open and you get on, and it feels a lot like rail. And so that type of experience is what we are trying to replicate and measure whether it makes sense on 24th. It does require having enough right-of-way available for the bus lanes at 10% again of the corridor, and then having enough room along the sidewalk and the curb for these full-size stations. We have heard a lot of good feedback that the stations are something that are pretty popular. So we don't want to see an Orbit line where we really have to like water down and diminish those features because they are so critical. So with that work, you can imagine it takes various steps in the process to do all of the engineering and planning work and property acquisition and construction. So we would say probably plan for about a 6 to 10 year timeline if this study recommends Orbit as the solution for 24th Street. Kind of the other option that we would be comparing it to would be what's called enhanced bus service. So that's more of a moderate capital and operational investment. The photo here is from the MAX line in Kansas City, which has won a lot of design awards because they came up with a solution that can be deployed pretty quickly. They just use bus shelters that are a standard size. They don't raise the curb, which means that it fits and transitions into the sidewalk much more easily than our full-size stations would. So it's adaptable, and it could be a preferred solution for the community. And so really what we're looking to do is to compare the two options and let the community lead the process of deciding one or the other.
And I would just add with that, I mean, I think there are pros and cons to both. There are a lot of pieces, I mean, particularly in sort of the how expensive and how long it takes to deploy these. But there's a lot of more things too, in terms of how it functions, how it works within the community. If you think back to those orbit principles that Evan talked about in terms of how closely together the stations are spaced versus a local bus where it stops more frequently. But of course, with some of those other investments in an orbit type service where the stops are further apart and there are bus lanes that are kind of redirected from traffic, that also adds some operational improvements and really enhances kind of the customer experience. So both of these are very valid, and maybe there's something else too. But we're just kind of sharing some of these initial thoughts. And as Evan said, we're going to really need input from the community, from those who live and work along the corridor, and those who believe in improving transit in the region to really help us shape the best solution for each individual corridor. Because every corridor, every neighborhood is a little bit different, and we need to find the right solution to meet each need.
Yeah, for sure. And anyone who's been on 24th Street knows that it's not like Dodge. In some places, Dodge is 8 lanes. And in most of the 24th Street corridor, there's only one traffic lane each direction. So we know before the study even begins that just copy and pasting the same solution is not going to work for this next line. With that, we are kind of planning on about an 18 to 24 month process to complete the 24th Street study. Again, the study area includes more than just 24th. It also includes North 30th Street, potential extensions to MCC North Campus, as well as considerations for extensions to the south of Q Street. So we'll need about 6 months for the procurement process. So that would mean that the official kickoff would be hopefully sometime next spring or summer. And we would be doing feasibility assessment, review of these alternatives, environmental review, and selection of the preferred alternative, preliminary engineering, which in industry terms gets us to 30% design. And that all basically puts us in the pipeline to apply for federal funds for final design and construction. So this process may seem very slow, but if we're able to truly pull it off by the end of 2023, we would be cutting several years off of the timeline, which we did for the Dodge Street orbit line. So this is progress, and I feel like our team has learned and improved our methods as we go. So I think the other component is now we've got a community that knows what orbit is, where with the Dodge Street study, a lot of our time was spent explaining what is this fancy bus thing that you guys are thinking about doing. So now that everyone kind of knows, more of the conversation is around how do we get what Dodge Street already has. So again, we just want to pause and make sure that that's the right solution and identify what makes the most sense through this study process. So stay tuned to learn more about that. But as Lauren mentioned, we are excited at the initial progress and what's ahead for the community there. So wanted to just go back to the full map and highlight some of these other corridors. So we've got 72nd Street from Emmanuel Hospital all the way down to the Ralston Arena. That corridor scored pretty high in the screening process. And so we've listed that as like a tier 1 corridor. Others that are included in tier 1 would be the North Beltline. So kind of just the section from Dodge up to our North Omaha Transit Center. And then also the First Avenue and Broadway corridor in Council Bluffs. So those 3 corridors are kind of the highest on the list for further study, but no timeline is identified, no funding is identified to look at those further. The remaining corridors, we've got Fort Crook Road and 13th Street into Bellevue, Abbott Drive to the airport, Ames Avenue, Maple, West Dodge all the way to Elkhorn, Center Street, L Street, and South 72nd into Papillion. Those are all corridors that we think are still viable and have potential if growth patterns and development and ridership patterns all kind of continue to build towards a major transit investment. So we know that transit and development are tied very closely together, and you can't have one without the other. So we basically are going to commit to keeping those on our radar and revisiting in the future so that we can continue to identify these corridors, knowing that it takes some time to develop the project. We don't want to have one project every 10 years. We'd like to get into a cycle where we're studying and building and studying and building so that we can aggressively complete this network. And I see Lauren made a little face here. So we have lots of conversations about how do we get in this cycle of doing this more aggressively with the bandwidth that we have. So that's a challenge, but it is exciting work. So with that, I am going to pause and pull up our remix activity. And actually, maybe before I do, it looks like maybe there's a couple new comments in the chat. So let's address those before we change the subject.
Yeah, there's a lot. And I will just say my face was simply a smile. I think we at Metro are very interested in keeping this moving forward and really focusing on how we can be planning and building at the same time. We are thrilled with the success of the Dodge Street orbit, but I think it also highlighted a need for really additional investment in other corridors. So we absolutely want to keep planning, building, and operating at the same time. So a couple of the comments that came in that were, there's actually quite a bit, which is super exciting, but around kind of corridors for future study around orbit, or at least the frequent network. We're about 90th Street and Sorensen Parkway and considering those. And then also the need for a tie between Fort Crook Road and Metro in South Omaha, for how really what Fort Crook Road would look like. And then why don't we start with those two, and then we have some more coming in too, if you want to take a first stab at them, Evan.
Sure. Yeah, so something to keep in mind is this is kind of only one layer of our full picture of our future network that we'd like to build out. So rapid service, we're really only looking at places that are the most dense, have the most trips, and really the most potential for highest levels of premium transit service. So 90th and Sorensen on this map is kind of shown here at moderate levels of suitability for transit. And so we can identify other solutions that are maybe more suited for that neighborhood, but probably our top level investment is not going to make sense at 90th and Sorensen right now. But again, that's not to say that we can't come up with other solutions. There are several people that I've heard from in that community that have reached out and requested additional service, and kind of a little nuance that has created some frustration is that Omaha city limits are just barely above 90th and Sorensen. So as Lauren mentioned, our taxing authority and our operating authority follows that boundary. So in some cases, there's an apartment complex just beyond that annexation line, and it kind of ties our hands a little bit in terms of the solutions that we can offer to those areas that aren't quite within our boundary. Let's see, the other areas that were mentioned, Lauren, can you remind me?
Yeah, so the other comment was really about the Fort Crook Road potential corridor and tying into South Omaha.
Yes.
And I will, I'll take a first stab at that and then correct me as I'm wrong, Evan, but absolutely. So this exercise overall was really about, okay, we know, I think we looked at 15 plus corridors and we know there's a need and there's an argument to be made for all 15 of them and probably others. But our goal was really to start to kind of prioritize, okay, got to start somewhere. What is the first 1, 2, 3, handful of corridors we should really start on first if we can't do all of them at the same time? So with that, each of these corridors will need a lot more study, just like we're going to do on 24th Street for corridor number 2, corridor number 3, and so on, to really refine them and figure out what makes the most sense. So one of the really interesting things with Fort Crook Road is it could go all the way straight into downtown, or maybe it would even connect in South Omaha to the 24th Street orbit corridor or enhanced bus corridor, whatever that looks like. All of those are options, and certainly none of these lines on a map are meant to be anything concrete as much as a way for us to really get community feedback on where we should start. And there's a lot of questions too about 84th Street, and particularly what about 72nd Street shifting over to 84th at Harrison, and then continuing south into Sarpy County and La Vista, connecting to density and then there's also a comment about connecting to the baseball stadium area in Sarpy County. So I think all of those are great. Certainly something we can and will consider as a part of MetroNEXT. We're kind of trying to do a couple of things. We're trying to identify sort of our ideal future network, some of which will be based on where we're going to operate buses, and some of it where we're going to really be doing construction along the corridors to change sort of the transit friendliness of the corridor. But we're also trying to put some, where do we start pieces of it? And I think, at least based on our initial analysis, 24th, North Beltline, and 72nd, to us have a ton of promise, but things change. Development grows, new businesses come in, new jobs, new transit-friendly infrastructure, more walkability projects that help people get to and from stations. So we absolutely expect there to be changes over the years, and all of those things. And actually, we got a question from Clyde, so we'll stop there for a sec. Go ahead, Clyde.
I just wanted to say that people living or working in Sarpy County need to lobby the county supervisors and their community governments to start considering joining the Regional Transit Authority once that gets established in the next year or two. That Senator Justin Wayne got that legislation passed, and I understand that Omaha Metro is going to become a Regional Transit Authority pretty soon, and that would enable communities then to join and extend the boundaries, but they have to willingly join, and that's going to take some lobbying.
Yeah, thank you, Clyde. That's a really good point. So just for a little bit of context for everybody, as I mentioned, we're the transit authority of the city of Omaha, and that's our limitation. There is the possibility for us to grow and become regional. But if any other community wants to join and become a part of Metro service area, that does take a lot of work and lobbying, and that's not a Metro decision. That's each of those local community decisions. So that's going to be a local decision that I think, all of these communities are going to have to grapple with and talk about the pros and cons and priorities of. So I think that's a really good context overall, that, Metro is very excited to hear these ideas, is very excited to dream a little bit and come up with our visions of what we would like to operate in these areas. But we can't do so without those partnerships. And it's really not our call, but Thanks for that comment. Oh my goodness, there's so many great comments coming in here. There's talking about the hospital on 84th, some express routes, particularly the 93, and then also talking about potentially going to Gretna and Alamo La Vista area to a potential new express route. And then I think another comment that's really relevant to this conversation is, could the studies for each of these corridor options overlap a bit more? And I think that is possible. I think that's something we would like to get to. We got to start with the next one, but I would love to see, okay, we do the planning study for one, and as we're moving that into sort of final design, before we even start constructing it, we start the early planning for the next one. I think with your help, we could certainly make that a possibility. It's going to take some really good grant writers. So if anybody is a great grant writer and wants to help Metro out with that, to help us come up with the funding for these studies, give me a call after the meeting. But I think that is where we're trying to get to, is we love the Dodge Street orbit and it's fantastic. But we don't want to start planning route number 3 after route number 2 is done.
All right. Sounds good. And just to answer Josh's question about the 99 Express to Gretna, that is something that's being proposed for our fixed route network. So just express, like rush hour service. It's not a rapid line. And it goes out the interstate and exits at 370. There's a state-owned park and ride lot there for carpoolers that go to Lincoln. So a potential idea would be to have a bus stop that picks up there and either offers service to the West Roads Transit Center or into downtown. And so that map is open for comment, and perhaps we can share that towards the end of this meeting. But for now, I think we'll switch to the map specific to tonight's topic. Annie, if you could put the link in the chat, thank you. This map is something that we've put together that is basically an interactive version of what I just presented on the slides. So with the map, you're able to select any line you're interested in. So if it's the South 72nd Street extension, you can select the line and then hit the button in the top right corner, post comment, and you could click and drag on the map and say, this should be on 84th Street instead. And so you just click your comment in, it'll give you the option to write a message. You don't have to put your name. If you put your email, I can respond to you directly. But again, email is optional. And one thing to know is if you put your name and email, it'll be visible to everyone. So all of these comments become public record. So that's something to be aware of. So feel free to check out that link now. If you're interested, you can start placing your comments here into the map. And as we have time, we can address those either live or we can follow up on questions through the chat. So one thing that I wanted to be sure to mention is as we get into the 24th Street study, we're still kind of formulating ideas around what exactly should be considered during that process. And so we're definitely looking for community feedback on what elements should be included in the study. So if you think consideration for station sizes or branding elements, 40 versus 60-foot vehicles, whatever it is, feel free to put that in the chat. Or again, if you'd like to talk through it, we can have that discussion. But again, we're looking for feedback on what should be considered as elements of this study process and what information should we review as we make this decision on what solution is best for 24th Street. And Andrew, glad you like the remix activity. I think it's pretty cool too. And so I see some comments here, Pacific, Blondo, Fort Street routes as a possibility, which wanted or made me want to highlight again the Transit Suitability Index. I kind of geeked out on that earlier. So just explain all of these little shaded gray hexagons are our Transit Suitability Index. And so what that does is take all the various factors that contribute to whether an area is likely to have high ridership and quantifies it as low, medium, or high suitability. So the factors that go into this are household density. So how many residents are in an area, how many jobs are in an area, how many essential services are in a specific area. And then also considering not just how many people live there, but who are they? Are they folks with a disability? Are they low income or minority? Do they have limited access to a vehicle? All of those components go into this Transit Suitability Index. And we also did a high level assessment of sidewalk access for one area versus another. So pedestrian accessibility is an additional factor that goes into that final scoring. So as you see those shaded hexagons on the map, that's basically predicting the level of ridership that we could expect for one little pocket of the community compared to other pockets of our region. So some of these, like Fort Street, you'll see has areas where it scores high and areas where it scores low. Pacific Street is another one. So that's this area down here, kind of between Dodge and Center Street. And you'll see that when you compare it to Dodge and Center, it doesn't have the current level of transit suitability that those other corridors have. So that's part of the reason why those corridors weren't selected to be reviewed for rapid transit. And again, in the broader context of MetroNEXT, that doesn't mean we couldn't come up with other transit solutions to serve the need in the area. It's just if there's different and varying levels of transit suitability, it indicates that there's probably a different tool that's a better fit to address that need. It looks like there's a couple more comments that might take me a bit to read through. So Lauren, I don't know if there's anything else you want to jump in on while we wait. And I'm just going to refresh the page and see if we've had any comments come through here on the map.
Yeah, so while you're doing that, I'll just share a few of the comments. Lots of questions, I think, about, you know, like you said, service on Pacific Street, questions about, you know, depending on what is actually selected and what type of service is on 24th Street, would that have impacts on other Metro local routes and possibly free up resources? I think the question was about freeing up resources on the current Route 18 to maybe put to the Route 16. I think all of these are really valid questions and things that may work. But I also, you know, the 24th and 18 do serve a little bit of a different transit network overall. But until we really know what that looks like, it's hard for us to give a concrete yes or no. I think what we're trying to do with this MetroNEXT study is identify the overall vision and not just a current, you know, city of Omaha fiscally constrained vision, but where do we really want to be? Identify our priorities and our first steps to start getting there, and then working with the community to really figure out those overall larger solutions. So let's see, connecting to Epley is coming in as an important conversation. That there's lots of comments on that. Good conversations on 90th Street really being a north-south corridor that needs to look at. And then questions just about sort of general operating. Will buses stop running after 11:30 during the week? Will that continue for good? So, yeah.
Yeah, so I can kind of click through some of those and try to answer as much as we can. The 11:30 end of service is kind of a limitation that we've put in place through the pandemic. We've seen travel patterns really kind of drop off at that time of night. At the same time, we've experienced a lot of difficulty in recruiting staff. And so as we balance, the changing demands for time of day that we should operate service and our changing capacity to deliver that service, that late night time period is the area where we identified that we probably should reallocate those hours into other times of the day. So as the situation changes and we have more capacity to bring that back, it's definitely not something that's off the table. But like I said, because of our constraints that we're planning around through the pandemic that continue to influence our day-to-day operation, it is something that will probably stay in place until the pandemic subsides. In terms of service to the airport, I actually have been having some good conversation with the airport authority and their forecasted needs into the future, and really trying to understand the travel patterns that they experience in terms of when they're busiest for flight times, departures and arrivals. And interestingly, their busiest times tend to be weekends, late night, and early morning, and all of which are when our system is kind of operating at its lowest. So there's a mismatch there that if we wanted to truly provide exceptional service to the airport, we would have to really ramp up our level of service at 4 a.m. In the morning, 11:30 to midnight, that time frame that I talked about, where the rest of our system is kind of going to sleep. So we also know that not everyone is going to travel from the airport to downtown. So the current Route 16, that route running, additional hours wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all solution, because people would have to take that line and connect to wherever else they need to go. And so we would need to basically add that level of service at these off hours for multiple lines in our system. So addressing high quality service to the airport is really much more complicated than we would like. But that doesn't mean we can't take interim steps to improve in that direction. So even if an orbit line isn't something that is top of mind for the next 5 to 10 years, that doesn't mean that we can't make incremental improvements with a fixed route or other type of solution to better address the need that we know is there. And I've been talking too long, and there's a lot of new comments that have come in. So let me scroll back through those for a second.
So there's some comments coming in about maybe having enhanced bus being a better option for 24th, or at least being considered, particularly around the station spacing, and then some of the amenities that are really crucial with that. And then a while ago, we had a comment really about sort of the importance of the snow melt and really kind of having winter-friendly stations on our next corridor. Clyde made a comment about one of the downfalls of orbit is the long station spacing between 49th and 62nd, and that the next orbit line should focus on being closer. And that also there was a suggestion of having a mini stop along Dodge Street too within that gap. Questions about individuals experiencing homelessness with orbit stations and really thinking about those plans overall. Let's see. More questions about the airport and really making sure that Metro is at the table for kind of future airport expansion plans, realizing that there are times of day where rideshare services like Uber and Lyft are difficult to access at the airport. Really the need to focus on first last mile using orbit, and particularly with walking and biking longer distances about it. And then I guess there was a comment about that we did have a non-orbit bus on the orbit route that caused some difficulties with putting a bike on the bike rack. So, wow, I can't even keep up. I'm not reading fast enough. The messages are coming in. I love it. talking about future route services for Epley. Evan, do you want to maybe take a moment to talk about the routes and schedule meeting and some of the conversations we had about, just general service and ways we can improve it, and the opportunity people have to share those comments for where we can add bus service overall?
Yeah, so if you give me a second, we've got, it seems like this might be a beneficial thing to share. So the map that I have pulled up right now is specific to the rapid network, but we also have a map, and it looks like Annie may have jumped to what I was trying to find. She's faster than me. We have a map that we're accepting feedback on that includes all of our different considerations together. So it does incorporate the airport and other areas. It includes that 99 Express, as Josh was asking about, in terms of service to Gretna. And so we're getting comments on that currently. And again, you're welcome to click on any line and offer specific feedback there. And so the airport is an area that's been identified as an area that needs further evaluation to determine how to best meet the short-term needs for the next 5 to 10 years. So if we're looking to amp up service, and we know that the situation today is not conducive to immediate upgrades, we want to take those incremental steps. And so we're working to identify what that looks like. And so in some cases, that may not necessarily be a conventional bus route that everyone thinks of. In some of these areas, we're highlighting and willing to explore new options that other cities are trying. And so we actually intend in our public meetings in December to really dive into what those additional options might look like. And it looks like we may have an issue. John mentioned that the URL might not be opening correctly.
All right, so while Annie is working on that, we also had a couple of comments come in on 24th Street. One was from Susan, talking about would property be taken from residents along 24th Street, and how would that be determined? So let me share a little bit of context. So our initial intention is to not impact any property owners along 24th Street. We do absolutely everything we can, just like we did on Dodge, to work within the existing right-of-way. But that's really what the point of that study that's going to take us through 2022 and 2023 is to really identify where the stations need to be, to look at property lines, to look at how much space there is, how wide the roadway is, how wide the sidewalks are. Where do we need to put stations or stops? Is there enough room for them? So we absolutely try to avoid that if at all possible. And that's really what that study is to have that 18 months to work with the community to figure out, should it be on this corner or that corner? Is there enough space to fit it? And to really design that out. So that's really the thought overall. Let's see. We talked about, okay, let's see, there's another comment here. So Joshua made a comment, it's unlikely property be taken, like Vinton, for instance, there's several places for an orbit stop there. Same with the L Street area on 24th. So exactly, Joshua. I mean, just like on Dodge, it takes a little bit of creative engineering and planning and working with the community on our part, but that would be our goal overall too. So comment about Dodge and Cumming, having an orbit stop on 24th. Okay. So I will defer this one to you, Evan. Is the data based on the newest and latest census and annexation data?
Yeah, I was writing a response in the chat. Unfortunately, when we did the suitability index mapping, that was back in the spring, and the 2020 census data wasn't released yet. So it is based on 2010. although the ACS components are from the most recent 3-year, or I guess it's 5-year average. So we incorporated recent data to the extent that we were able to. And in terms of annexation, that information was current. And yeah, just a note for users that are on their phones, we know this remix activity isn't great if you're using mobile. So if you want to save the link and look at it on a browser later, you're more than welcome to do that. And you're likely to have a better interactive experience when you can kind of see the full picture. So apologize that it doesn't work better. That's something that we have tried to identify a solution to. And that's unfortunately just one of the setbacks of this tool that we're using.
Yeah. We are at about an hour, so I do want to wrap it up and be respectful of people's times. But I would just add to that this remix activity, as well as a recording of one of these presentations on the Rapid Transit Network, will be on Metro's website. So you can share it there too. There is a question about the project on 24th extending to adjoining streets like 25th, 26th. Susan, I think that's entirely possible. And that's why we want to really take the time to really focus on what exactly makes sense. Obviously, when you're focusing on rapid frequent transit, straight lines are great, but we also want to make sure we're connecting to the community and fitting within the fabric of the community, and really working with sort of the community's overall mobility and design and identity. So all of those questions are to be determined. And I love this feedback because this gives us a lot of really good things to start thinking about and start planning around before the study even kicks off. And same with Joshua's comment about thinking around the Kroc Center. So great. Evan, do you want to talk about the next upcoming meetings?
Yeah, so we are excited for the first time through MetroNEXT to offer in-person meetings starting next week. So December 7th, that's a Tuesday, 5 to 6:30 at the Charles B. Washington Library in North Omaha. The following day, Wednesday, December 8th, 5 to 6:30 p.m. again at the MCC South Campus in the connector lobby adjacent to our South Transit Center. Sunday, December 12th, if that works better for you, will be at Westro's from 2:30 to 4. Tuesday, December 14th, we're going to offer a virtual meeting from 6 to 7 p.m. Wednesday, December 15th from noon to 1:30. That will be here in our Metro lobby. So mask policies will kind of apply based on the specific venue that we're in. For example, our Metro facility is under the TSA, as are all of our vehicles, which means that masks will be required for that meeting. For topics that will be covered, it's kind of wrapping up all of the mini sessions that we've held over the past few weeks. So if you want to talk more about route amenities, routes and schedules or rider amenities, more conversation face-to-face about the Rapid Transit Network. We also will be discussing our new fare system, UMO, as well as potential expansion to new areas. So kind of the topic will include all of those things and more. So anything that you'd like to talk to us face-to-face about, we'd welcome you to do so. And again, all of this is really helping us gather as much information as possible for us to process and turn into scenarios that we can present back to the community early next year, so that we can continue to develop the MetroNEXT plan. Let's see. Yeah, Clyde is mentioning the one-way couplet on 24th Street between Dodge and Leavenworth. Currently, Route 24, when it's traveling southbound, has to jog around to 25th Street. And yes, that will be a portion of the study, is kind of comparing alternatives for a two-way conversion that would allow, at a minimum, transit service to run both ways on 24th Street, and probably looking at multiple scenarios for how that would be configured, but definitely something that we'd like to take a look at as well. But yeah, for the sake of time, we're 5 minutes past. So if you guys have other questions, be sure to follow up. We have various ways that you can engage with us. So whatever is easiest for you, if it's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, our Twitter channel, those are all listed on the screen. ometro.com/metronext is the website that you can engage and find all of the documentation of this information. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's just a generic comment box that will go directly to us. So if you're not a social media person, the website is an easy way to get whatever feedback is on your mind into our inbox. So with that, we'll end the meeting. And again, we thank you all for your time.